Stop. Before you scroll. Before you skip. Before you decide this is just another story about a girl who suffers prettily and gets rescued by a man in a nice suit. You need to hear what they actually did to her. Because what happened on that cliffside road on a cold, rainy Tuesday evening was not a misunderstanding. It was not a petty argument between young women with wounded egos. It was not the kind of conflict that gets resolved with an apology and a lesson learned. It was four people, with every advantage the world had granted them, trying to break one person who had been surviving on almost nothing for years. And that one person, Soraya James, was one breath from the edge of a cliff while they laughed. Let me paint this picture for you properly, because it deserves to be rendered fully before we go any further. It is 8:47 in the evening. The rain has been falling for over an hour. Not the soft, cinematic kind you see in romance films, not the gentle mist that makes city lights blur beautifully in puddles. This is the cold, heavy, indifferent kind of rain that drives itself sideways against your face and soaks through a jacket in minutes and turns unpaved paths into ankle-deep mud. The kind of rain that feels less like weather and more like the universe announcing, with considerable clarity, that it has no interest in your comfort tonight. Halcyon University's main campus is nearly deserted. The lecture halls have emptied. The library will close in an hour. The student lounges glow warm and golden through their fog-streaked windows. Inside those windows, there are students with their laptops and their hot drinks and their easy laughter. Students who have not spent the last 14 hours working and studying and pretending, very deliberately, that they are not exhausted all the way down to the marrow of their bones. Soraya is not inside any of those windows. She is out here, in the rain, on the cliffside path that curves behind the arts building and follows the ridge of the hill before descending toward the residential area below. It is a path that most students avoid. It is long. It is poorly lit. It winds dangerously close to the hill's edge in three places, where the ground falls away without ceremony and the drop is considerable, and the university maintenance team has been promising to install better barriers for 18 months. Soraya takes this route because the main road is brighter and busier, and she is 22 years old and already bone-tired of the way people look at her in bright, busy places. The looks that linger too long. The eyes that flick to her wheelchair and then away again. Too fast, as if looking were a small crime they are trying to minimize. The smiles that are too wide and too gentle, compensating for something they feel but cannot name. That particular blend of pity and discomfort that people produce when they encounter a disabled person living her life with the same unremarkable dailiness as everyone else, and find it somehow surprising. On the cliffside path, nobody looks at her. There is only the rain and the dark and the sound of her wheels on wet stone and the distant rumble of thunder over the hill, and that is enough. That is, tonight, more than enough. Her name is Soraya James. She is black. She is disabled. She is 22 years old. She has 3 scholarships stacked on top of each other, representing the combined investment of an economics foundation, the university's own merit program, and a community arts grant that she applied for by submitting a portfolio of academic work so focused and intellectually rigorous that the committee had asked if they could publish portions of it. She is a Dean's List student every single semester since her first. She is a professor's research assistant, a position she earned not through networking or charm or any of the social currencies that usually flow through institutions like this one, but by submitting a paper so thorough and so carefully argued that Professor Aldridge read it twice before looking up and saying quietly, as if to himself, that he did not often see this quality of thinking from undergraduates. She is also the girl whose mother died 4 years ago in a car accident on a road that should have been safe. The girl whose father sent one text message after the funeral and then vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The girl who raised herself in the wreckage of that grief, while simultaneously helping to raise a grandmother who refused to behave like a woman who was ill, who insisted on making tea and telling stories and pretending that the coughing was nothing, that the medication cost what it cost, that everything was fine. She is the girl who works a 4-hour evening shift at the campus cafe after attending 6 hours of classes and 2 hours of research sessions with Professor Aldridge, who eats half a granola bar standing behind the counter and calls it dinner, because the rest of her money is already spoken for. She is the girl who has mapped out her finances to the dollar every month for 3 years. Medication first, rent second, food with whatever is left. She is the girl who has never, not once, complained about any of this. Not publicly, not in the way that might have generated sympathy or support or a different kind of attention. She keeps it all internal, folded away, because complaining takes energy, and energy is a resource she cannot afford to waste. She is not a victim. This needs to be said clearly before this story goes any further. Soraya James is not a victim. She is a woman who has survived a very hard series of events with a level of dignity and forward momentum that most people could not sustain for a week, let alone 4 years. She wakes up every morning and moves forward because she has decided to, because her grandmother is counting on her, because her mother worked 2 jobs to save for a house with a garden, and Soraya intends, with everything she has, to honor that, which is exactly what makes what happens next so impossible to watch. Soraya moved her wheelchair along the cliffside path with the steady, practiced rhythm of someone who had been doing this for years. Weight distributed, hands positioned to manage the slope, textbooks wrapped in a plastic bag balanced across her lap because the rain had started before she finished her shift and she hadn't thought to bring a waterproof cover. The cold had worked its way through her jacket 20 minutes ago. She was not thinking about the cold. She was running mental calculations about whether she could pick up an extra hour on Saturday morning, whether the pharmacy would give her another week on the medication before the payment was due, whether she had time to finish the secondary sourcing for Aldridge's lecture notes before Thursday. She almost didn't hear them coming. The headlights of 2 cars swept across the path in front of her, flooding the wet stone with harsh white light. And then 4 doors opened. And then there was laughter. The sharp, unhurried kind that belongs exclusively to people who have never been afraid of anything, who have never had to be. Well, well, well. Vanessa Cole stepped out of the first car and the rain seemed to part around her. Or perhaps it was only that her cream wool coat was so impeccably maintained that the weather looked like a personal insult it was afraid to deliver. She was beautiful in the way that precision instruments are beautiful, designed for a specific purpose, and extremely effective at it. Behind her came Marcus, who was her shadow and her laugh track. Jade, who laughed at everything Vanessa said, and had been doing so for 3 years, and Devon, who never spoke, but whose silence had a quality to it. Watchful, faintly amused. That was somehow worse than words. Soraya tightened her grip on the wheels. She did not move backward. She did not flinch. She had been practicing stillness for years, had made it into a discipline, a form of armor that could not be easily pierced. "I'm going home, Vanessa," she said. "Home." Vanessa repeated the word as if tasting it, turning to exchange a smile with Jade before looking back. "That little apartment off 5th with the broken radiator? I heard the landlord still hasn't fixed it. How is the heating situation these days?" She tilted her head. "How is dear grandmother doing, by the way? Still coughing?" The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Soraya felt the impact, a tightness in her chest, something cold moving through her, and absorbed it without allowing her face to register a single degree of the reaction. She had practiced this too. Vanessa walked slowly closer. The rain was soaking through her coat now, but she showed no sign of noticing. Do you know what genuinely kills me? Her voice dropped, became almost conversational, the way that very practiced cruelty sometimes sounds reasonable. Professor Aldridge gave that assistant position to you. Over me, over a 4.0 GPA, over 3 years of student council leadership, over everything I have built in this institution. Her eyes moved over Soraya with an expression that was not quite contempt, and not quite something else. And it wasn't even close. He said, and I was told this by someone who was in the room, that your understanding of the material was exceptional. It is, Soraya said. That's why he said it. Something shifted behind Vanessa's eyes. Your mother died in a car wreck. Your father couldn't even stay long enough to bury her properly. You wheel yourself around this campus pretending the world owes you something, pretending that disability and poverty are credentials rather than circumstances, and everyone falls over themselves not to say what they actually think. Her voice had gone very quiet. But I'm done performing that particular kindness. Soraya held her gaze. Move your car, she said. Her voice did not shake. She would not allow it to shake. Vanessa straightened. The smile disappeared. And then, without a word, without hesitation, without a flicker of uncertainty, she stepped behind Soraya's wheelchair and shoved. The wheels hit the gravel at the cliff's edge. Soraya grabbed both armrests, her heart slamming against her ribs. The wet ground gave way under the front wheels, pebbles scattering over the edge and disappearing into the darkness below. The drop was 40 feet at least. Maybe more. She could hear the rain hitting the rocks far down. The wheels stopped. 1 inch. 1 breath. One small miracle of traction. Jade made a sound, half gasp, half laugh that died immediately. Even Marcus had taken 2 steps backward. Devon had gone very still. And then, headlights. A vehicle had stopped on the road above them. A black car, long and well-maintained, its engine idling quietly in the rain. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out without an umbrella, without hurry, as if the weather were simply a condition of the world that he had acknowledged and moved past. He was tall. He wore a dark suit that the rain was quickly ruining, and he showed no sign of caring. His face, in the headlights, was completely unreadable, but his eyes had seen everything, every detail, every second. Vanessa turned, and for the first time in the entire encounter, she went completely still. Because everyone in this city recognized Ethan Kang. The years before the cliffside. There is a photograph Soraya keeps in the front pocket of her backpack. It is bent at one corner and slightly faded from years of careful handling, but she has never had it restored or framed because touching it too deliberately feels somehow like using up what remains of it. In the photograph, a woman is laughing. A real laugh, the kind that happens before you can compose yourself, the kind that reaches the eyes and the shoulders simultaneously. She is holding a small girl on her hip. The child has wide, bright eyes and 2 perfectly round puffballs in her natural hair. They are both looking at something outside the frame, something that made them so happy the joy spilled right through the camera. The woman is Soraya James, Soraya's mother. She died 4 years ago on a Tuesday evening in November, on a road in the city's East District that should have been completely safe, hit by a driver who had run a red light at 60 miles an hour. Mara had been coming home from her second job. She had been working 2 jobs for 3 years, saying she was saving for a house with a garden, somewhere Soraya could study without hearing the neighbors through the walls, somewhere there would be enough space for Rose to have her own room, somewhere that felt, in Mara's own words, like something they had actually chosen rather than simply landed in. The paramedics told Soraya later that she had been trapped in the passenger seat for 40 minutes before they got her out. She remembered certain sounds, metal, glass, something that might have been her own voice. She remembered calling her mother's name repeatedly, with the single-minded insistence of someone who believes that volume alone can fix something. She did not remember the specific moment her spine was damaged, but she woke up in a hospital 3 days later and understood from the particular quality of the doctor's face, the careful neutrality, the professional compassion positioned over something harder, that the news was going to change her life's shape completely. She would not walk again. The doctors used careful language, graduated language, language designed to soften the landing at each stage of understanding. But all the careful language pointed in the same direction. Her father, Winston James, came to the hospital on the first day. He sat beside her and held her hand and told her he loved her and that everything was going to be all right, in the way that people say things when they are telling the truth about their feelings in the moment and not necessarily making a promise they can keep. He came the second day. The third day, he did not come. She called him. He didn't answer. She called again. By the time she was discharged, he had stopped answering entirely. 3 weeks after the funeral, she received one text message. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." And then permanent, complete, explanationless silence. The kind of silence that is itself an explanation, and a devastating one. It was her grandmother, Rose, her mother's mother, small and silver-haired and 72 years old at the time and already not entirely well, who came to collect her from the hospital in a taxi. Rose rearranged her small apartment to accommodate the wheelchair. She stayed up late reading about spinal cord injuries on her phone, reading articles she didn't fully understand, and writing down questions for the physiotherapist in a notebook she kept by her bed. She told Soraya, without sentimentality and with complete conviction, that the last word was never the final word. Rose also had a respiratory condition that required ongoing medication and regular treatment. The medication was not cheap. The treatment clinic was across the city. Soraya learned the route in the first month and then built her entire schedule around it. She applied for every scholarship available. She got 3. She enrolled in university, an institution that required 2 buses and a campus mobility map and a great deal of advanced planning for someone navigating it in a wheelchair, and she figured all of it out methodically, in the same way she figured out everything else. She took the cafe job because the income covered what the scholarships didn't. She took the research assistant position because the stipend meant 2 more months of Rose's medication. She had not, in 4 years, taken a day off. Not really. Not a day where she did not think about the calculations. She also, in those same 4 years, read everything she could find. She stayed late in libraries that were closing. She submitted papers that other students took 1 draft to write because she wrote 3 and revised each one until it was as close to exactly right as she could make it. She did this not because she was trying to prove something, not primarily, but because the work itself had become one of the few places where everything else went quiet, where she was not a caregiver or a budget line or a girl with a history, where she was just a mind, moving through ideas. That was the part Vanessa could never understand, that Soraya did not do exceptional work to compete with anyone. She did it because it was the only part of her life that was entirely hers. 18 months before the cliffside, Vanessa Cole had grown up in a house with a staff of 4, a mother who scheduled her piano lessons alongside her skincare appointments, and a father whose name appeared regularly in newspaper profiles with words like visionary and powerful positioned close together. Senator Raymond Cole had been a fixture of state politics for 14 years. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and changed their atmosphere without saying anything, and Vanessa had been watching him do it since she was 8 years old and had absorbed the lesson so thoroughly that she barely knew she was performing it anymore. She had come to Halcyon University expecting to rule it. This was not arrogance, not exactly. It was a reasonable extension of all available evidence. She was beautiful, well-connected, academically capable, and socially skilled in the particular way that comes from years of practice, in rooms where the wrong move is expensive. She was the president of the student council within a year of arriving. She was the face of every charity gala photograph. Professors remembered her name. Donors noticed her. She wore her status the way other people wear skin, as something fundamental to identity, not as something that could be removed. And then Soraya James arrived on a full scholarship in a second-hand wheelchair, with a brain that operated faster than almost anyone Vanessa had ever encountered, and did so without any apparent interest in being noticed for it. It began with small things. A presentation in the economics seminar they shared, where Soraya's analysis of market failure mechanisms left the professor standing at the whiteboard for several seconds before he could formulate a response. A paper in the second term that earned the highest grade in the department, not the highest grade among scholarship students, the highest grade, full stop. A moment during a faculty-student panel where Soraya, without raising her voice or adjusting her expression, systematically dismantled 3 separate arguments and proposed a more coherent framework in the time it took the other panelists to arrange their notes. Vanessa had watched each of these moments with a practiced smile on her face and something she could not comfortably name moving in her chest. She told herself it was irritation. She told herself it was principle. That Soraya's success was built on manufactured sympathy, on the discomfort people felt around disability, on a kind of institutional guilt that wasn't the same thing as merit. She told herself these things because they were easier than the alternative. Then came Daniel Kang. Daniel was Ethan's younger cousin, a second-year student who had arrived with every material advantage and almost none of the accompanying attitude. He was quiet and genuinely curious, and he cited people's ideas with full credit even in casual conversation. Vanessa had identified him as a strategic priority within 2 weeks of his arrival. A Kang connection would be worth more than any academic credential she could earn. But Daniel had chosen to study with Soraya. They met in the library on Tuesday afternoons and sometimes lost track of time entirely. He brought her tea on cold mornings, not as a romantic gesture, but because he'd noticed she didn't stop for breaks, and he thought she should drink something warm. He told anyone who asked that she was the most intellectually honest person he'd met since arriving at Halcyon, by which he meant that she said what she actually thought, and cited the sources for it. Vanessa's hands shook under the table the first time she heard him say this. She kept her face still. When Professor Aldridge announced the research assistant position, Vanessa had prepared a full proposal. She had researched his current work. She had worn the right dress to his office hours and deployed the right register of engaged interest. She had done everything correctly. He chose Soraya. He said it was because her understanding of the material was exceptional and her intellectual commitment was evident. That was the night Vanessa decided. Not that she would compete with Soraya, not that she would outperform her, that she would destroy her. The cliffside. Moments after Ethan Kang said nothing as Vanessa and her friends got back into their cars. He simply stood in the rain and watched the headlights disappear around the curve of the hill, and the sound of the engines faded into the distance, and then there was only the rain and the dark, and the girl at the edge of the cliff who had not moved, who was gripping the armrests of her chair with both hands, knuckles pale against the wet metal, staring at a fixed point in the middle distance with the specific, practiced composure of someone who has learned, through considerable necessity, not to come apart in front of strangers. He stood approximately 15 feet away. He did not approach without permission. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence do what silence sometimes has to do. "Can I drive you home?" he asked finally. Soraya looked at him. She had read Vanessa's reaction, the flash of recognition, the immediate recalibration of the entire situation, and understood that whoever this man was, he carried a significant weight of power. She had not fully processed the name yet. She only knew that she was soaking wet, and her arms were still trembling from the impact of what had nearly happened, and she was not, tonight, going to make it home on her own without a serious loss of composure that she preferred not to have in public. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed simply. "But you almost went off a cliff, and it's raining." A pause. Then, "Fine." The drive was almost entirely silent, which was exactly what she needed. He did not ask her how she was feeling. He did not offer sympathy. He did not perform concern or ask leading questions about what had happened, and she was grateful for this in a way that surprised her. Most people, when confronted with her, resolved their discomfort by either ignoring her entirely or making too much of everything. He simply drove, as if driving were the task, and he was doing the task and nothing else was required. The apartment building on 5th Street had a ground floor unit with a ramp that the previous tenant had installed, and the current landlord had agreed to maintain, though the execution of this agreement was inconsistent. Ethan came around to her side of the car and opened the door, and she navigated her chair onto the sidewalk herself, and he did not reach for her handles without being asked. That, too, she noticed. The apartment door opened before she knocked. Rose, who had an uncanny sensitivity to the sound of wheels on the front path, stood in the doorway wrapped in her cardigan, her eyes moving immediately to Soraya and cataloging her the way grandmothers catalog, searching for damage, for signs of distress, for the particular quality of stillness that meant something was being suppressed rather than resolved. Then Rose's eyes moved to Ethan. She studied him with the unhurried patience of someone who had been reading people for 72 years and had no interest in pretending otherwise. "Come in out of the wet," she said. And her tone was not surprised. Her tone was the tone of a woman who had been expecting this particular visit, in some form, for some time. Ethan stepped into the small hallway. It was a clean space, arranged with intention around the necessities of Soraya's chair. Clear pathways, lowered hooks, a kitchen stool positioned for easy transfer. There were books everywhere, a handmade quilt over the sofa, a jar of dried freesias on the windowsill, long past their season but still kept. Rose offered tea. Ethan accepted. For a few minutes they sat at the small table and spoke about nothing in particular. The rain, the campus, the late hour. In the way that people sometimes do when they are taking the measure of each other before the real conversation. Then Rose set down her cup and looked at him with her clear, patient eyes and said, "You look like a man carrying old sadness." Ethan went completely still. It was not an observation anyone had made to him before. Or perhaps it was an observation that only one other person had ever made, in the same kind of voice, quiet, certain, without either judgment or performance, and that person had been gone for 8 years. He thanked Rose quietly. He said goodnight to Soraya. He left. In the car, he sat without starting the engine for a long time. He was thinking about a photograph in his own possession, a school photo, slightly faded, of a girl with his same dark eyes who was smiling in that particular way of people who have learned to smile at cameras without showing what the cameras aren't supposed to see. His sister, May. She had been 17 when she died. She had been bullied for 2 years by classmates at her school. The school their parents had chosen because it had the best academic record in the district, which had not turned out to be the only thing that mattered. May had told no one. She had attended every family dinner and done her homework, and been strong in the way that young girls are implicitly taught to be strong, which is to say, quietly and alone, and without troubling anyone. And then, one afternoon, she had been walking home from school on a road not unlike that cliffside path, and a car had come around a corner too fast, and she had moved to avoid it, and the ground had not held. Ethan had been 24. He had built his entire company in the years after, with the singular focus of a person who needs the work to occupy all available space. He had done this successfully. He had built one of the largest private holdings in the region. He had given to causes and built programs and hired good people and made decisions he was proud of. None of it had fixed the thing it was built to fix. He started the car. He already knew with complete clarity that he was not going to be able to walk away from this. Kang Group headquarters. The following morning, Ethan's assistant, Ji-ho, placed the folder on his desk at 7:45 in the morning with the particular care of someone who understood that what was inside it was going to matter. Inside was everything Ji-ho had been able to compile in 12 hours, which was considerable. Soraya James, 22 years old. Scholarship recipient for 3 consecutive academic years, each scholarship renewed on academic merit without condition. Dean's List every semester since enrollment. Part-time employee, campus cafe, 4 evenings per week. Research assistant, Professor Aldridge's Economic Theory program. Primary caregiver for Rose James, grandmother, 68 years old, diagnosed chronic respiratory condition requiring ongoing medication and quarterly clinic visits. Ethan read the document once, then again. Then he turned to the second document Ji-ho had quietly attached to the back of the folder. It was a record from Kang Memorial Hospital. The hospital that bore his family's name because his grandmother had donated the cardiac wing 23 years ago. The record was from 11 months ago. A patient named Eunice Kang had been admitted for cardiac arrhythmia during what was supposed to be a routine checkup visit. She had been alone in the waiting room when the episode occurred. The record noted that the emergency response had been initiated not by hospital staff, who had not yet been alerted, but by a young woman in a wheelchair who had been visiting a different department and had seen Eunice collapse and had immediately wheeled herself across the waiting room and stayed with her, speaking to her calmly and steadily, keeping her focused and her breathing regulated until the nursing staff arrived. The young woman had stayed for 3 hours after the medical team took over. She had sat with Eunice in the corridor while they waited for the family to be reached. She had held her hand. At one point, and this was the detail that made Ethan set the folder down on his desk and look at the window for a long moment. She had gone to the hospital pharmacy and paid for a medication Eunice needed before the family's insurance authorization had processed. She had done this out of pocket. The amount was $62. She had not left her name. The nurse's notes recorded only, young woman, wheelchair, very calm. Ethan had known for years that $62 was not a small amount for a person in Soraya's financial situation. He knew it now with a precision that felt different from knowing it abstractly. $62 was 1 week of a grandmother's medication. It was a calculation made and a sacrifice executed without hesitation for a stranger in a hospital hallway. He leaned back in his chair. The city was gray and moving below his office windows. People like her, he said quietly to no one in particular, are rare. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Ji-ho. The second was to his legal team. Act 6. Vanessa's plan, the 2 weeks before the charity gala. The Halcyon University Annual Charity Gala was the most important event in the campus social calendar. And it was, consequently, the event Vanessa had been planning around for the better part of 3 weeks. It was held every spring in the Grand Meridian Hall, attended by students, faculty, major donors, city officials, and, this year, for the first time, several members of the state senate. The event raised money for educational access programs, which was almost unbearably ironic, given what Vanessa had spent those 3 weeks constructing. She had been careful. She was always careful. The campaign she built against Soraya was not a single action, but a series of precisely placed pressures, each one calculated to land where it would cause maximum long-term damage with minimum traceable origin. The first was a rumor, seeded through Jade into the athletics common room, that Soraya had been seen leaving Professor Aldridge's office very late on multiple occasions, and that the research assistant position might not have been earned entirely on academic merit. The rumor was designed to be unprovable and impossible to disprove, which was precisely its function. The second was a comment Marcus dropped, apparently casually, in the graduate student lounge, that Soraya had been observed getting into expensive cars at unusual hours. He mentioned no names, he provided no details. He simply left the implication floating, in the room like smoke. The third was an anonymous post on the campus forum. Devon, who had the patience of a man who had never been required to hurry, created it using a network of devices that could not be traced back to him. The post included photographs, nothing explicit, nothing that proved anything, but the framing suggested everything. Soraya saw the post on a Wednesday morning. She read it once. She closed the browser. She shredded nothing because there was nothing to shred. No documents, no letters, no physical evidence that could help her. She went to her shift at the cafe. She worked for 4 hours. She went home. She did not tell anyone. She was still, at this stage, operating under the assumption that silence was the most dignified response and that dignity was the most effective armor. She did not yet know about the fabricated email. Vanessa had spent considerable time and skill producing it. It was addressed to a fictional older donor, written in language calibrated to suggest that Soraya was deliberately cultivating relationships with powerful men for financial gain, using her disability as a tool of sympathy to extract money and favors. The language was designed to be ambiguous enough that it could not be definitively proven false while being specific enough to be fully damaging. It named no names that could be checked. It provided no details that could be verified either way. It was entirely, completely, carefully invented. Vanessa had the letter laminated in a presentation sleeve. She planned to produce it at the gala, in front of the senators, the donors, the faculty, and everyone else who mattered in this world she had spent 3 years building. She planned to stand at the microphone and say Soraya's name out loud and hand the room something it could use. Soraya arrived at the gala in the only formal dress she owned that wasn't from a discount rack. A simple, fitted deep green that her grandmother had found at a church sale and pressed with a care so meticulous it looked like it had just come off a rack at full price. She had done her hair. She had told herself that this was just another evening to get through. She did not know the trap was already assembled. She did not know that in 19 minutes, Vanessa would step up to the microphone. Grand Meridian Hall, 8:12 p.m. The room was full and warm and glittering. The chandelier above the main floor threw light in all directions, catching the glasses and jewelry and careful faces of 200 people who had dressed for precisely this kind of event. The speakers had been good. The dinner had been acceptable. The donations were tracking slightly above last year's projection. Vanessa took the microphone with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years and took her time with the opening. She thanked the organizers. She praised the evening's cause. She spoke, with a straight face that would have impressed a seasoned trial lawyer, about the importance of integrity within academic communities. Then she said, "Before we continue, I feel a responsibility, as student council president, and as a member of this community, to bring something to the attention of this room. The quality of silence in a room changes when something is about to happen." Soraya felt it before she understood it, that specific, weighted stillness that precedes public cruelty. She looked up from her table at the back and found Vanessa already looking directly at her. "I have in my possession documentation suggesting that a scholarship recipient, someone who has benefited significantly from the generosity of this institution and its donors, has been deliberately misrepresenting herself and manipulating relationships with powerful figures for personal and financial gain." Vanessa's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. Using her disability as a sympathy mechanism, targeting faculty, targeting donors, constructing a false narrative of need to extract financial support. She held up the laminated sleeve. "This is a letter," in her own words. 200 heads turned toward the back of the room. 200 pairs of eyes. Soraya kept her hands in her lap. She was aware of her own heartbeat. She was aware that the room was very large and she was very visible in it. She thought about Rose at home, making tea, humming something wordless in the kitchen. She thought about the photograph in her backpack. She thought, I will not give her this. Not publicly. Not in this room. Her name, Vanessa said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, is Soraya James. And then the doors at the far end of the hall opened. They opened slowly, quietly, without announcement. The kind of entrance that does not require preparation because the person making it understands that arrival itself is enough. Ethan Kang walked into the Grand Meridian Hall in a dark jacket with rain still visible on the shoulders, and the room recognized him before he had covered 10 feet of floor. The recognition moved through the assembled guests like a current, a subtle recalibration, a collective adjustment of posture and attention. Senators who had been leaning back in their chairs sat forward. Donors who had been checking their watches went still. He walked past all of them. He walked past Vanessa and the microphone and the laminated envelope. Past the faculty tables and the student council section. Past the chandelier and the carefully arranged centerpieces and the warm, glittering promise of an evening that had been going very smoothly until a moment ago. He walked the entire length of the room without pausing, without acknowledging anyone, with the perfect unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going. He stopped beside Soraya's chair. He crouched down, deliberately, without self-consciousness, until his eyes were level with hers. And in a voice that was quiet enough to be private and clear enough to carry to the nearest tables, he said, I've been looking for you. Soraya looked at him. For a moment she said nothing. Then he stood. He turned to face the room. The senators, the donors, the faculty, Vanessa still holding the laminated envelope, all 200 people who were holding their collective breath. And his voice was calm and entirely final. This woman is under my protection. Anything said against her tonight will be addressed in full by my legal team, starting tomorrow morning. The room did not breathe. Vanessa's hand dropped to her side. Someone near the front coughed. Someone else whispered to their neighbor. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, Daniel Kang stood up from his seat and began to applaud. Slowly, deliberately. The way people clap when they mean it, and they want everyone to know they mean it. A professor near the window rose. 2 students by the door. The sound built. Not a rush, not a wave, but a steady rising, until more than half the room was on its feet, and Vanessa Cole was standing alone at a microphone with a piece of paper that no longer meant anything. The corridor outside the hall. Later, that evening, they sat in a corridor near the tall windows that looked out over the campus courtyard. Ji-ho had quietly located 2 chairs and then disappeared with the tact of someone who had worked for Ethan long enough to understand which moments required a third person and which didn't. The noise of the gala was muffled behind the closed doors. Below the windows, the courtyard lights reflected in the puddles from the previous night's rain. Ethan sat beside Soraya, and for a while neither of them spoke. He had begun, after a moment, to say something, to explain himself, to offer context, to do what people in his position usually did when they had performed a significant act and were waiting to be understood. She stopped him. Stop. He stopped. Soraya was looking at the courtyard below. She was very still in the particular way she was still when she was choosing her words with precision, deciding how much of herself to spend, and on what, and whether the expenditure was worth making. I know about your grandmother, she said. The hospital, 11 months ago. I know that's part of why you're here. A pause. And I know what happened to your sister. He looked at her sharply. Daniel told me? She said simply. not as gossip. He carries grief for her the way families do when they don't know how to set it down. We talked in the library sometimes, on Tuesday afternoons. He admired you very much, and he missed May in a way he tried not to show. She looked at Ethan directly. I am sorry about her. Genuinely and completely. And I understand why she is present in your mind when you look at me. That's not... It's part of it, she said, without judgment. I'm not suggesting it's the entire reason. I'm not suggesting your intentions aren't good, but I need you to understand something. Her voice did not waver. I do not need saving. I need respect. These are not the same thing, and most people spend their entire lives not understanding the difference. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. The courtyard lights shifted as a cloud moved overhead. What does respect look like? He asked. It was not rhetorical. It was a real question, asked with the particular quality of a person who genuinely wants to know the answer and understands they might not have considered it fully before. Soraya considered. It looks like asking before acting. It looks like believing that I understand my own situation better than someone who has known me for 48 hours. It looks like recognizing that I have been making every decision about my life, every single one, for 4 years without anyone's assistance, and that I have not been doing it wrong. She paused. It looks like helping because you genuinely want to, not because it makes you feel less guilty about a grief that was never your responsibility to carry. He absorbed this. She could see him doing it, not performing consideration, but actually reconsidering. I have been doing this wrong, he said after a moment. Haven't I? You've been doing it the way almost everyone does it, she said, which is to project a narrative onto someone instead of asking what they actually need. What do you actually need? She looked at him. It was a question no one had asked her, not directly, not as the opening of a real conversation, in a very long time. Right now, she said carefully, I need someone to not make what happened tonight about themselves. I need the legal situation to be addressed, because it will be. Vanessa's father has resources, and she will use them. And she looked back at the courtyard. I need to go home and check on my grandmother and eat something, because I haven't eaten since this morning. Something shifted in his expression. He said nothing about the last part, which she appreciated. All right, he said. Then I'm asking. Can I help? With the legal situation? Soraya was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully. With some things. On my terms. It was not love. Not yet. It was the beginning of something that might, if they were careful with it, be capable of becoming love. And that was rarer than most things, and worth considerably more. 72 hours after the gala. Vanessa Cole had never, in 22 years of a life arranged around advantage, lost anything without finding a way to burn down what had defeated her. It was not a strategy she had articulated consciously. It was simply the operational principle she had absorbed from watching her father navigate every setback. That the appropriate response to humiliation was not retreat, but escalation. That power unused was power wasted. The gala had been the most public humiliation of her life. She had stood at a microphone in front of senators and donors and faculty, and been made irrelevant by a single act of quiet authority from a man she had been planning to one day call an ally. She had felt the room shift. She had felt her social architecture, 3 years of careful construction, develop a crack that she could not plaster over. And the worst part, the part she could not admit to anyone, including herself, was Soraya's face. That terrible, undisturbed dignity. That refusal to perform distress. That composure that did not break even in the moment of maximum public pressure, as if Soraya had looked at the situation and decided that Vanessa was simply not worth the cost of a reaction. It made Vanessa want to cause damage in a way that went beyond strategy. It made it personal in a way that frightened even her. A little. She called her father that same night. Raymond Cole listened in silence through the account she gave him. Edited, reframed, positioned carefully, because she knew even in her fury that the raw truth would not reflect well on her. When she finished, he said, with the efficient calm of a man who had been managing crises for 14 years, "I'll handle it." Within 72 hours, three things happened simultaneously. The hospital where Rose James received her respiratory treatment received a notice of funding reallocation, a procedural document citing budget review priorities that would, if processed, effectively end Rose's access to the subsidized treatment program she had been enrolled in for 18 months. The community housing authority that provided the subsidy for the apartment on 5th Street received a zoning review request for the building, a detailed legal document that would require significant time and resources to contest, time and resources the housing authority did not have in surplus. And within the university, a formal academic integrity complaint was filed against Soraya James, anonymous, detailed, citing fabricated evidence including the same letter Vanessa had displayed at the gala, submitted through the university's confidential complaint system in a way that triggered mandatory investigation. Soraya received 3 letters in one morning. She sat at the kitchen table and read each one while Rose made tea in the kitchen and hummed something old and wordless to herself, a song without lyrics that she had been humming for as long as Soraya could remember, something that might have come from her own grandmother. Soraya put the letters down. She looked at the window. She breathed slowly and deliberately, counting the breaths the way she had learned to do when she needed to stay inside her own body instead of disappearing into the emergency. Then she picked up her phone and called Ethan. Not because she could not handle it, not because she was surrendering any decision-making authority. She called because she had said on her terms, and asking for help when the situation required and when help was available was not weakness. She had learned the difference between dependence and trust, and they were not the same thing. She had learned it the hard way, over 4 years, and she was not going to unlearn it out of pride. "Tell me everything," he said when he answered. She did. The week everything changed. What Ethan had not mentioned to anyone, because it had not been relevant until this particular morning, was that he had been quietly cooperating with a federal financial crimes investigation for the better part of 8 months. Senator Raymond Cole's office had been under investigation for a pattern of financial misconduct that the investigators had been building a case around methodically and carefully. Scholarship fund misappropriation, bribery of 3 university board members, and the illegal redirection of state educational grants, money designated for access programs, for students like Soraya, into private holding accounts connected to the senator's political network. The investigation was thorough. The evidence was substantial. But it had stalled at a critical juncture because the key documentary thread, an internal correspondence between Cole's office and the university's financial department, was locked behind institutional protections that required a court order to access. The academic integrity complaint filed against Soraya had been submitted using exactly that institutional infrastructure. It was part of the same correspondence thread. Ethan's legal team submitted the thread to the court on Monday morning. The order was granted by Tuesday afternoon. The investigation resumed with full access to documents it had been circling for 8 months. By Thursday, Senator Cole's office had been raided. His university connections were suspended pending review. 2 of the 3 board members resigned before the end of the business day. The third issued a statement through his lawyer. The academic integrity complaint against Soraya was dismissed on procedural grounds. The complaint mechanism had been used fraudulently, which rendered it void. The housing subsidy review was withdrawn. The hospital funding reallocation was reversed when the investigation revealed it had been initiated through channels connected to Cole's office, Rose James's treatment program was not interrupted. She never knew how close it had come. Vanessa's world did not collapse all at once. It went room by room, the way that structures fail when the foundation is compromised, first slowly, then completely. The student council presidency was suspended pending the university's internal inquiry. Her friends, Jade first, then Marcus, then finally Devon, who had always been loyal only to proximity to power and who relocated that loyalty with swift efficiency. Each made their exits. The public image she had constructed over 3 years encountered the specific problem of public images built on performance. That when the performance is interrupted, the audience remembers everything. Students who had been dismissed, overlooked, or maneuvered around over 3 years turned out to have very accurate memories and very functional platforms. Vanessa sat in her apartment, the large, well-furnished one her father had paid for, and looked at the wall for a long time. For the first time in her life, there was nothing to arrange, no event to plan, no impression to manage, no version of herself to project. She was not certain who she was without those things. That uncertainty, more than anything else that had happened, was the real beginning of the reckoning she would spend years working through. Soraya, when a campus journalist asked for a statement, said, "I hope she learned something, that's all I have." The journalist later wrote that it was the most devastating sentence she could have chosen. The journalist was right. Spring arrived the way it always did in that city. Quietly, without ceremony, as if it had simply decided the gray had persisted long enough and was now correcting the situation. The trees along the campus walkway were in full bloom on the morning of the graduation ceremony, white flowers against a sky that was finally and completely blue. The chairs had been arranged on the great lawn in long rows facing the stage. Students in robes moved in loose, unhurried groups toward the assembly, some already crying, some laughing too loudly, some doing both at once in that particular way of people who are at a threshold and have not yet decided what feeling is appropriate. When Soraya's name was called, the dean did not rush his words. He spoke about academic excellence and the kind of persistence that does not perform itself for audiences. He mentioned her research contributions. He mentioned the work she had done on Professor Aldridge's lecture series, which had since been cited in 3 separate academic publications. The applause when she crossed the stage was longer than protocol required, and she did not mind. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had received 3 job offers in the previous month, each from institutions she respected, each in a field she cared about. She had declined 2 and accepted 1, from a research institute whose director had reached out personally with a letter that spent 2 paragraphs on her specific work before mentioning the position, which was the right order of priority. Rose was on a new treatment protocol that was working. Her cough had improved measurably over the past 6 weeks. The apartment on 5th Street had new heating, installed finally by a landlord who had received a firm letter from a legal firm he did not want to hear from again. Soraya had quit the cafe in March. The morning after her last shift, she had come home at midnight and sat in the kitchen for a few minutes, and then she had gone to bed and slept for 10 consecutive hours. When she woke up, she lay still for a while and tried to identify what she was feeling. It took her some time to recognize it. Relief. Simple, uncomplicated relief. The kind that only comes when something you have been carrying for years is finally, actually, set down. After the ceremony, the crowd moved outward in a slow tide of photographs and reunions and families finding each other across the lawn. Soraya found a quiet place at the edge of the gathering, beneath one of the flowering trees at the boundary of the campus. She had the photograph out. The bent, faded one of her mother laughing, holding a small girl with puffballs in her hair, both of them looking at something outside the frame. And she was looking at it in the way she sometimes did when she needed to say something she couldn't say out loud. She heard footsteps on the grass. She recognized them. Ethan stood a few feet away. He was in a dark jacket. No tie, which she had come to understand was his version of informality. He looked slightly uncertain in the way that people who are accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room look when they arrive somewhere they were not expressly invited and are not certain of their welcome. He was holding a small bunch of white flowers. Freesias. The same kind her mother had kept in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. The same kind that Rose still kept, long past their season, in the jar by the window. Soraya looked at the flowers. She looked at him. How did you know? Daniel mentioned it, he said. Something you told him, once, about your mother. She looked at the flowers again, then at the photograph, in her hand. Then, slowly, she put the photograph back in the pocket of her backpack and held out her hand for the flowers. She laughed. A real one, unguarded, unheld, the kind that arrives before you can decide whether to allow it. It surprised her. It surprised him. Sit down, she said. He sat. Beside her, not across from her, which she noticed. The tree above them was in full bloom, and the petals fell occasionally in the light wind and landed in her hair and on the shoulders of his jacket, and neither of them did anything about it. I read the research paper you submitted to the Institute before accepting the offer, he said. The full version, not the abstract. She raised an eyebrow. And? It's remarkable work. He said it simply, without the inflation that people sometimes put under compliments to make them land bigger. He said it the way he said most things, with the directness of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the most respectful thing you could offer a person was your honest opinion. I know, she said, which made him smile, which she had not seen before, and which altered his face considerably. They stayed under the tree for a while as the crowd on the lawn thinned and the afternoon light shifted through the blossoms overhead. They talked about the research, about the specific argument she was developing, about where she wanted to take it, about the questions she had not yet found satisfactory answers to. He asked questions that were good questions, which meant they were difficult to answer, which meant he had actually read the paper. At some point, without announcement, the conversation became something else. Not more serious. It had been serious already, but more present. More honest in a different register. She told him about the morning she had woken up after her last cafe shift and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that she might be able to breathe normally. He listened without interrupting. He told her about building the company in the years after May died, about the way work had been both refuge and avoidance, how he had known the difference and done it anyway. She listened without offering reassurance, which was what he actually needed. I'm not the same kind of person I was 3 months ago, he said. It was not a claim designed to impress her. It was an observation he appeared to be making in real time, with some surprise. I know, she said again. Then, after a moment, neither am I. The afternoon moved slowly around them. Eventually she picked up the freesias, which had been resting across her lap, and looked at them for a moment. Then she put them carefully into the side pocket of her backpack, beside the photograph. Can I walk beside you now? He asked. It was a real question. She understood that. It was not a metaphor or a gesture or a closing line designed to end an act cleanly. It was a man who had learned, over the past 3 months, to ask before acting. Asking. Soraya looked at him for a long, steady moment. Only if you can keep up, she said. She began to move, forward, as she always had always intended to. One wheel rotation at a time toward everything she had earned and everything that was still ahead. He walked beside her. Not behind. Not ahead. Beside.